Welcome back to another AP World History video lecture, and this time we're handling the issue of decolonization. Okay, big topic. What is that all about? After World War II, the countries in what we call the developed world, or typically the countries below the equator, had been under imperialism for basically over 100 to 150 years with Europeans. And you probably remember, too, they had to deal with the problem of social Darwinism, scientific racism. Well, here's the good news about World War II. Hitler made all of these ideas morally bankrupt. People started realizing in the West how horrible the idea of scientific racism was, and it was being challenged across the world. In fact, to give you one example, there was a philosopher and psychologist, an African philosopher and psychologist named Frantz Fanon. Frantz Fanon made the argument that holding these racial theories of inequality actually created the very systems of inequality, because for people who were underneath that, they had taken in this belief that they were inferior, and they were trying to fight against it. And that's why they needed their own sense of nationalism, their own sense of self-determination. Now, once these countries did gain their freedom, they faced a number of huge obstacles. Internally, they faced everything from ethnic conflicts to religious strife to the problems of military dictatorships. And probably one of the biggest problems was transnational companies, companies located in the United States, Britain, and France, going in and exploiting the resources of these newly freed countries. Okay, we're going to go over 4 examples to demonstrate that. Our first case is probably the biggest one, and that is India. India is sort of the model of decolonization because it got started off the earliest. In the late 1800s, there was a group called the Indian National Congress, and the INC was attempting to gain independence from the British. Problem was the leaders in the INC were under indirect rule from Britain. Remember, those were the guys put in charge by Britain to run the day-to-day things. So they said, hey, look, we want our independence, but not so fast. We need the British here to kind of protect our power. Well, out of this group came a man named Mohandas Gandhi. And Gandhi was a part of the middle class. He was well educated. He was doing incredibly well until he hit World War I. In World War I, he was traveling around fighting for the British, and he noticed as he did that, traveling the railroads, that he was always put in the back of the railroads. Why? Because he was a person of color. This started off his quest to gain independence and freedom for the Indians. Now, he fought that, coming up with an idea called Satyagraha. Satyagraha was an Indian spiritual idea coming out of Hinduism, calling for the middle path, not violence, but also not a rejection of Britain altogether. Rather, nonviolence, accepting there were some good things the British had brought, but at the same time, the need for independence for the Indians. Now, the big event that changed everything was called Amritsar. At Amritsar, the Indians had been protesting nonviolently. They were protesting in an area that was enclosed in walls. Well, the British brought in tanks and mowed down all the people there who were basically nonviolent. That led to pressure from around the world to gain independence. And finally, Gandhi won his fight in 1947. But the British did something pretty nasty. They divided people in India between Indian Muslims and Indian Hindus. They stoked the fear amongst Indian Muslims that because the Hindus were of such a great number, they would oppress Indian Muslims. There was a man named Muhammad Ali Jinnah who formed the All-Muslim League, and he called for a partition. The northern part of India would become its own country, Pakistan, and the southern part would be Hindu India. Well, that's what happened, but in the midst of that, there was a huge civil war, and over 1 million Indians lost their lives. Case number 2 is the Middle East. Now, we kind of know this today of the fight between the Israelis and the Palestinians, but where did that all get started? So you might remember the Ottoman Empire controlled this region of the world from 1300 all the way up to World War I. When they fell apart, Britain and France split up that area into the countries that we know in the Middle East today. This was called the Mandate Plan. Well, then the British did something kind of strange. They made promises to 2 different groups of people. To Jewish people, they said, under the Balfour Declaration, the Jewish people could move into the area and form a homeland, form their own nation state. But then they passed a group of white papers where they told Arabs, don't worry, we're going to protect your land rights in this area. What were they really after? Well, the British were using a divide and conquer strategy. They promised both sides in order to increase tensions so they could remain in control of the area, especially for access to oil. In the end, in 1947, the United Nations stepped in and said, we're going to partition out this land and divide it up amongst Arab Palestinians and Israeli Jews. The Arabs turned against this and said they didn't want to have it. And so the Jewish people proclaimed the entire area Israeli. When that happened, 5 Arab states attempted to attack the Israeli nation. We still see that conflict today between the Arab Palestinians and the Israeli Jews. Case study number 3. So case study number 3 has to do with an internal fight amongst religious groups, but also with what happened from the external side of this. It has to do with Iran. Within Iran, remember, the Ottoman Empire fell, Iran was created, and a family was put in charge called the Pahlavis. But at one point, the people in Iran got kind of sick and tired of the Pahlavis because they were allowing for the British to come in to exploit oil. The company that was doing this was British Petroleum. So they elected a socialist leader into power, a man named Mohammad Mossadegh. Mossadegh promised to nationalize the oil companies and keep profits within Iran. Well, the American CIA trained a group of Iranians to overthrow Mohammad Mossadegh, and they placed back into power the Pahlavi family. Now, the Pahlavi family did a lot of good for the country. They actually fought for women's rights to be educated. They fought for a redistribution of land. But they also established something called the Savak. The Savak was a secret police that put people into prison, especially liberals and communists and Muslims. So eventually there was a revolution in 1979 that overthrew the Pahlavis, kicked them out of Iran. It eventually got dominated by a Muslim cleric who was of the Shiite faith called Khomeini. Khomeini imprisoned all people who were not Muslim, and he moved the country into a theocracy. Okay, case study number 4. Case study number 4 takes place in South Africa. In South Africa in the 1700s, the Dutch had settled in South Africa, claiming that this was their new Jerusalem. In the late 1800s, there was a fight between the British, the Dutch, and the African tribes there, especially the Zulu tribes, over the gold mines that were there. Well, the British won the war, but they promised the Dutch, in order to keep the peace, that they could have racial hierarchies over the Zulu tribes. And by the end of World War II, there was a system put in place called apartheid. Apartheid was an extreme form of segregation based upon racial hierarchies. Well, a man fought against this named Nelson Mandela, and Mandela initially fought through nonviolent means. But there was an event that took place at a police station called the Sharpeville Massacre. This is where, as Africans were protesting nonviolently, guns were brought out, machine guns, and mowed down these nonviolent protesters. Mandela believed the only resort they had was to guerrilla warfare. Well, he was eventually put in prison and remained in prison until 1991. In the 1980s, a South African president named de Klerk was trying to get rid of apartheid because of how bad it looked on the world stage, and he eventually freed Nelson Mandela. Nelson Mandela ran against de Klerk for the presidency of South Africa and became the next president of South Africa. Okay, so looking at all these case studies, what's our takeaways that we can take from the process of decolonization? First off, World War II did help to end imperialism and show how the notion of social Darwinism was morally bankrupt. The problem within these countries is there are internal forces that divide against each other, like ethnic forces and religious forces, and external forces that have also been a problem, like transnational companies coming in and extracting resources from these countries. Today, we are still living with these big conflicts, religious, ethnic, and national conflicts that are still haunting us, left over from that imperial age. Okay, I'll see you in class.